So nice to see everyone here tonight. Thank you. I have a PowerPoint presentation with some images and a little bit of text to give you something to look at while you listen to me tonight. I hope that we can make this interactive. I would love it if you want to contribute with a question or a comment, just get my attention and maybe we can make it more of a conversation that way. I am a retired professor of communication studies and performance studies at Emerson College in Boston. Has anybody ever even heard of Emerson College? Oh, good. It was founded as a private school of oratory and expression in 1880, and it still has as its focus communication and the arts. I'm from Texas originally, a native of Waco, and I went to Baylor and the University of Texas at Austin. And I have been doing Chautauqua for quite a while now. I started in 1994 with Henry James and then William Faulkner and Robert Frost and Washington Irving. And in the last couple of years, I've added a few more characters, most recently Ernest Hemingway, which I performed here. And when I came here in, I'm not sure what year anymore, to do William Faulkner, I was doing a rehearsal at the Pan Shell the first night, and I mentioned as Faulkner that I had written the screenplay, but To Have and Have Not, which starred Humphrey Bogart. And Delisa, I think, raised her hand and said, "You know that he got married here, don't you?" And I had no idea that Humphrey Bogart had gotten married here, or at Mount Farm. And that started me down the road of learning more and more about Louis Bromfield. And the next year, I think it was, they invited me to develop a performance as Bromfield, which I have never done since until Saturday night. I'll get to do it at Mount Farm, which will be a real treat. And also tomorrow night at Ashland University, my colleague Karen Branch, who has performed many times in the Ashland Chautauqua with me and by herself, the two of us will read a play that we have developed about the friendship between Louis Bromfield and Edith Wharton. So I encourage you to come to that tomorrow night at the Wrong Lecture Hall at Ashland University. So, with that in mind, I wanted to explain the title that I've chosen for this presentation. I hope you can see this. The Sinatra of the Soil, Louis Bromfield's Advocacy for Ecology. And the basis, the central idea of my presentation is that Bromfield became a celebrity for a number of reasons, and he used that celebrity to advocate for soil conservation, ecology, and sustainable agriculture. So there's sort of two parts to my presentation. The nature of his celebrity and then his use of the celebrity to raise awareness about ecology and soil conservation. But the title itself, the phrase, the Sinatra of the Soil, is a little ironic actually, because it was coined by Louis Bromfield's manager and secretary named George Hawkins as a kind of derisive term for Bromfield. George Hawkins started working for Bromfield when he was a celebrated novelist and screenwriter in Hollywood, and he came to France with the Bromfield family for a number of years, and then came with them to Malabar Farm when he created it. But Hawkins was a city guy. He didn't really cotton to living out in the country, and when Bromfield gave up writing the kind of novels that taught him a lot of success, Hawkins would always have to type up the books that he started writing about agriculture, and he referred to that writing as humus and mucus, wretch and vetch. And he thought that Bromfield was wasting his talents as a creative writer by going out to all of these grange halls and garden clubs, giving talks about ecology, and so he referred to him as the Sinatra of the soil in a sort of derisive way. Sinatra being a popular entertainer, and he thought that Bromfield was going in the wrong direction, and he resisted it all as much as he could. But Bromfield had his own mind about these things. So the Sinatra of the Soil captures the duality of the popular entertainer, the celebrity, and the soil conservationist and agriculturalist. So let me show you a preview here of the main topics. I'm going to talk about authors as celebrities kind of briefly, and then I wonder if it would help turn the lights off so that people can see this a little bit better.
Can't see it all, so we could see it.
Well, I'm afraid I can't do anything about that. So at least you'll see the pictures a little bit. I think that's the main thing. The text isn't as important. Well, I'll talk about authors as celebrities. I'll talk about Bromfield as a celebrity. And then I'll talk about Bromfield's advocacy for ecology. So this is an image of Bromfield. I would assume people all are pretty familiar with Bromfield out here. Is that the case? A local boy makes good. Born in 1896 in Mansfield, and went to high school here. His parents came from several generations back in the area. His grandfather had been his mother's father had been the first master of the Grange as a sort of master farmer. So he grew up in the farming community of Mansfield, but then they moved into the city because his mother, Annette Coulter Bromfield, really wanted her children to be well educated and to get off of the farm and make a name for themselves. She had 3 children. The first one, Marie, from the time she was conceived, Annette Bromfield wanted her daughter to become a concert pianist. So while she was in utero, she played the piano, and sure enough, she, from the age of 6, Marie was forced to practice her piano every day and did have a career, but not a very successful one, unfortunately. And then Louis was the second child, and then there was another son named Charlie Jr. So people, I assume, know that he's from here, but that he went away. He first went off to Cornell, to agricultural school. That only lasted about a year. He came back. He tried to take over his grandfather's farm after his grandfather passed away. He did that for a year, sort of an agreement with his mother. She said, if you will do this for a year, you'll see how hard it is, and you'll want to get out of here. And sure enough, that's what happened, because he also had wanted from a young age to be a writer. Just as she had wanted her daughter, Marie, to be a pianist, she wanted her son, Louis, to be a great writer. And she made him read Dickens and Fielding and Thackeray, and it took with him. He became very serious about wanting to write. So after that year working on his grandfather's farm, he took off again to go to Columbia Journalism School. But he gave up during that year to go off to World War I. So he was an ambulance driver in World War I, like Hemingway, who was somebody he later met and became friends with for a time. And that created a lifelong love of France for Louis Bromfield. And after the war, he came back to America, to New York, got married. His wife was from sort of old Brahmin stock in New England, Mary Appleton Wood Bromfield. And they had their first child. They had 3 children eventually, but the first daughter was born, Anne, in America. And then they decamped and moved to Paris. And they, right outside of Paris, a little town called Senlis. And he created a fabulous garden there in Senlis and became pretty well known in France as a gardener. And then lasted until about 1938. So during the late 20s, early 30s, he was in Paris, or outside of Paris, and he was a very well-established novelist. I'll tell you more about that as we get further into his celebrity. So that's what gave him the money to afford to live in France. his success as a novelist. But in 1938, when World War II was on the horizon, in World War I, Senlis had been in the path of the Germans when they took over, well, they fought right in that area, and he knew that that would happen again, so he wanted his 3 daughters and his wife out of Paris and Senlis, which would have been and was eventually in the path of the Nazis. So that's what led him back home, where he had always wanted to come back to. So that's, in a nutshell, the trajectory of his life. And so let's talk about authors as celebrities a little bit. These are pictures of me as William Faulkner and Robert Frost. And I think actually the photographer is here. Didn't you take a picture of me? Oh, okay.
I didn't take those.
Oh, well, this one is what I thought you might have taken, because this is in Ashland. This is, Oklahoma. But anyway, I got started doing these characters who were authors. Other Chautauquans perform as other kinds of historical figures. Even Lizzie Borden came last year. But I've always specialized in authors. And the more I've worked with authors, I started out being interested in their writing, but I discovered more and more how many of them, oh, you're going to be able to get up on boxes. I'll pause here.
If you pause for a minute, you might be able to get your shirt. Sure. You can just lift it up. Is that helpful? Yeah. Is that helpful?
Thank you.
So starting out with Henry James and then William Faulkner and Robert Frost, Washington Irving, each character I took on seemed to be more and more of a celebrity until I sort of hit the jackpot with Ernest Hemingway, who, as I worked on Hemingway, I discovered people are more interested in Hemingway for his personal life than they are in his writing, really. It's interesting, too, that so many of the writers that I've worked on, their homes have become sort of sacred sites, and people make pilgrimages to them. So I've been to Roanoke in Oxford, Mississippi, where Faulkner lived. I've been to at least 2 of the houses that Frost lived in New Hampshire and Vermont. And of course, I've been to Malabar Farm. How many of you have been to Malabar Farm? I would hope everybody has. Okay, good. That's one mark of when a writer becomes a celebrity, when their homes become destinations and sites for pilgrimages. So Ernest Hemingway was the figure that made me realize that there's a whole academic specialization in celebrity studies now. There are journals, academic journals on celebrity, and I think it's one of the things that make Louis Bromfield so remarkable is how he transcended being just a successful novelist and even an advocate for soil conservation. He became somebody that in the 30s and 40s and into 50s, people read about in magazines. He was covered in the society columns in New York City. He was connections to Hollywood, had a lot to do with it. And when he hosted the wedding of Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, that really put him in the higher echelons of celebrity. So, Bromfield as a celebrity has a number of notable characteristics. First, as an author, as a New York nightclubber, especially in the 20s, he would come back, when he would live in France, he would come back periodically to New York and live the high life. He ran an expatriate salon in Senlis. He was very well connected in Hollywood. He was a media personality. I think the most prominent example of that is the Bogart-Bacall wedding. But he was also on game shows, radio game shows, like Information Please. There's an internet archive where you can actually listen to recordings of these television shows where they had a couple of regulars, like Franklin P. Adams, who was an important figure in the literary world, but then they would bring in guests for every show, and Louis Bromfield was a popular one. And it's really funny to listen. It was a game show sort of like, well, people were invited to write in questions to try to stump their panel of experts. And if you did successfully stump them, you won $25 and a set of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And so it's fun to listen to him banter on these old radio shows. And then finally, he's a famous farmer. In fact, Malabar Farm is often referred to as the most famous farm in America. And so these are some of the dimensions of his celebrity. Let me pause here and see if anybody wants to make a comment or ask a question, ask for more information. Feel free to, I just want to remind you. So I'm going to talk about some of these in a little more detail here. First, the whole machinery of creating celebrity is something that he had some familiarity with. In 1923, remember he fought in World War I, it was over in 1918, came back to America in 1919. So in the early 20s, he was living in New York, trying to make a career as a writer, and he got a job as a music critic for Time magazine. He was on the original staff of Time magazine. And he got a job in advertising for the publisher Putnam's. And so he would help promote the careers of Putnam's writers. And he learned how to embellish their biographies. And in fact, he claimed, or Putnam's publicized, that he had won the Croix de Guerre, the war medal that was given by France. And you find that crop up in various accounts of Bromfield's life, but it's not true. It was just puffery, publicity puffery that he learned how to do working for Putnam. In 1924, his first novel was published, The Green Bay Tree, and it's inspired by the family that lived in the Oak Hill house in Mansfield, which I highly recommend touring that as well as Malabar Farm. It's basically his great aunt and her daughters are the inspiration for that novel. He wrote, he had all these jobs writing constantly. He worked for the Associated Press. He was doing this book reviewing occasionally. And at night, usually he would write on his novel. And then it got published in 1924. It became a bestseller. It became a critically acclaimed bestseller. And so that launched him, and he made enough money on that enabled him to take his family to France. So The Green Bay Tree was published in 1924, leading to more reviewing for magazines like the Bookman and the New York Sun. And then also in 1924, he associated with the famous Algonquin Round Table of wits, the vicious circle of wits that included Dorothy Parker, Alexander Woolcott, Robert Benchley. He was a junior member. He wasn't one of the main players in the Algonquin Round Table. He did become very good friends with Edna Ferber, who wrote Giant and Showboat, and they knew each other in France as well as in the Algonquin Round Table. So, I wanted to highlight the year 1927 in particular because not all of these things happened in the same year for him. Remember, he was born in 1896, so he's just 29, 30 years old in this year. Early Autumn, his third novel, won the Pulitzer Prize. It was 1927, obviously. And so the first novel had been The Green Bay Tree, the second was called Possession, and then the third one was Early Autumn. He took a lecture tour in the United States. He developed a couple of lectures about cultural fads, including the New Woman and internationalism. He was always very focused on looking at the big picture internationally. He was one of the people who warned that World War II was on the horizon, and he tried to get America involved to overcome their isolationism from a fairly early time. Well, it was interesting, on his tour, his lecture tour, he went to Oak Park, Illinois, which was where Ernest Hemingway's mother was living, where Ernest Hemingway had grown up. By this time, he knew Hemingway in Paris, and he was giving this lecture on the new woman, and Grace Hemingway came up to him afterwards, and he told her, "Oh, I'm one of your son's best friends." And she wrote Hemingway sort of gloatingly, "Oh, I met your friend Louis Bromfield." And Hemingway by this time had kind of gotten over Louis Bromfield. Louis Bromfield was more successful than Hemingway at this time, and he actually tried to help Hemingway find better publishers. He ended up going with the advice of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who they all knew, and going with Scribner's instead of the publisher that Bromfield had recommended. But he was a nice guy to Hemingway. He tried to help him out. They socialized quite a bit. But as he became more and more successful and his books outsold Hemingway became more and more embittered. And in his letters to other people, he's vicious about Louis Bromfield. I have just written a chapter for an upcoming book about Hemingway and his friends, and my chapter is on Hemingway and Bromfield. And so I did a deep dive, even going to the Hemingway papers at the JFK Library in Boston. And Hemingway, well, people had issues with Bromfield too, so I suppose, everybody has their dark sides, but Hemingway was particularly vicious about Bromfield. Bromfield always sort of rose above it. He never, retaliated. I never saw anything that Bromfield said negative about Hemingway. But there's quite a paper trail of all the insults that Hemingway lobbed at him. The Green Bay Tree, his first novel, was adapted for Broadway as a play called The House of Women. And it only lasted 40 performances, which wasn't a great run, but his short story, The Scarlet Woman, won an O. Henry Award, and then was later made into a movie with Anne Harding called The Life of Virgie Winters. A Good Woman, his fourth novel was published. So it was Green Bay, Tree, Possession, Early Autumn, and the fourth is A Good Woman. And he called these four novels panel novels because they were like Balzac's human comedy. They were a kind of linked series of novels that kept revisiting the same characters and expanding the network of those characters. And he thought he might continue in that vein, but after A Good Woman, he stopped writing panel novels and started writing individual novels. And then finally, Vanity Fair featured Louis Bromfield as one of the most important writers in America. Notice that he won the Pulitzer in 1927, which would have been the same year that The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway was published. Sun Also Rises was considered too risque for the Pulitzer Committee, so it was never seriously considered. But that is a good index of the relative importance of these two writers at that time, that Bromfield was winning the Pulitzer Prize in the same year that Hemingway wrote The Sun Also Rises. Let's see. Yeah, I'm getting into the advocacy on Collier. Let me just finish some of these celebrity points. As far as his nightclubbing, he was a fixture at nightclubs like 21 in New York, and he would go out with Humphrey Bogart. They had met when Bromfield reviewed one of the plays that Bogart was in on Broadway. That was a very small role for Bogart when he was just getting started. But they became friends, and they would go out to these nightclubs. And Bogart introduced him to sort of the low life of New York, and he got ideas for later works from those experiences. He, let's see. often accompany actresses to these nightclubs, especially Kay Francis, who later had a lead in a movie of his novel, 24 Hours. And when he was in New York and his wife, Mary, was back in Paris, he would write about this, and she was always very blasé about this. So I don't know that there's anything going on between them, but he was somebody who was often written about in gossip columns for squiring around these Hollywood and Broadway actresses. As far as his salon at Senlis, he and his family would have these sort of Sunday brunches where they would set up a buffet, and they had this fabulous garden on the Nonette River in Senlis, and hordes of people would descend on them, 40 to 50 people for brunch, including writers like Gertrude Stein, the Maharani and the Maharaja of Baroda. He got to know aristocrats and diplomats. The friendship with the Maharani of Baroda led to him later going to India and writing The Rains Came, his novel about India, and it was made into 2 different movies. So there were people who were movie stars, who were writers, who were aristocrats, all hobnobbing. He loved to mix people like cocktails, he said, and to see what would happen. So it was a pretty lively crowd. If you come tomorrow night to the reading of the play about the friendship between Edith Wharton and Louis Bromfield, you'll hear a little bit more about that. His connections to Hollywood were interesting. Because he was a successful novelist, the movie studios in the 30s would bring famous writers from New York out to Hollywood to write screenplays. So at first he was just writing screenplays and doing script doctoring and treatments, as they're called, like outlines. He worked on the movie Dracula with Bela Lugosi. So he did a lot of little jobs like that. And then it wasn't until a little later that movies started being made of his own works, especially The Rains Came, which was a big hit in 1939 with Myrna Loy, and was nominated for Academy Awards the same year as Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. And that was the first year they ever awarded an Academy Award for Best Special Effects. And it was up against The Rains Came, which was a disaster movie about an earthquake and a flood in India. Really spectacular for 1939. It beat out The Wizard of Oz for Best Special Effects that year. And that movie holds up really well. He was hired by Samuel Goldwyn to write screenplays for $2,500 a week in 1929, right as the Depression was hitting. So he was, in high cotton with all of these contracts he was getting for his books and for his screenplays. And it got to the point where in the 40s, he was able to sell a screenplay before he'd even written the novel. So that he sold Mrs. Parkington, which was made to a movie with Greer Garson and Agnes Moorehead. Both of them were nominated for Academy Awards. He sold that on speculation, basically, as a movie before he finished writing the novel. So he was, able to command great prices for his work. One little thing that I came across today, by the way, if I had a chance, is Timothy McKee here? I read his fascinating blogs. He's a Richland historian, Richland County historian. He wrote an interesting blog about the friendship between Louis Bromfield and Humphrey Bogart, and I learned that they'd got to know each other in New York before Bogart was a big deal. In fact, his career was kind of languishing until he did a play called The Petrified Forest, where he played a gangster, and it was made into a movie, and they kept him from the Broadway cast in the movie. It was actually Leslie Howard, who played the other lead role in that, who also played Ashley Wilkes, who insisted that he wouldn't make the movie unless they kept Humphrey Bogart in the gangster role in the movie, and that got him out to Hollywood. And at that point, Bromfield was well established in Hollywood, and he was staying at the Garden of Allah, which was a famous sort of motel court, you know, with little cabana places. And he got Bogart in there, and that sort of helped Bogart make the connections that launched his movie career. So they were very helpful to each other. Yes?
I was just wondering, so if you're looking at his employment or like his businesses, was he running 3 things in different countries?
Was he running what?
Like, was he running the salon in Paris and then he was running his, did he have a nightclub? And then Malabar Farms, like, was that all happening at the same time?
He would just attend nightclubs in New York, primarily, when he would go there. But when he was living in Senlis, he would go back to America periodically, and he wrote plays that were done, not only House of Women, but also Deluxe, which was not very successful on Broadway. He wasn't as successful as a playwright as he was as a novelist and a short story writer and a screenwriter. And then he would make these trips to India, several month-long trips, and they would leave their children. Mary would come with him, and they would leave their children with the nanny, and George Hawkins, the secretary manager, would come too. And so he had 2 long trips to India where he really learned a lot about agriculture as it was being practiced in India, and that influenced what he did in Malabar Farm. So they also, you know, they had a lot of money in the 20s and 30s. They would go skiing in Switzerland on a regular basis. They sent the daughters to boarding schools in England. And so he would go to the Pyrenees. That's one of the places that he and Edna Ferber hung out together in Spain. So he was a world traveler. In this play, we talk about going to Sweden and meeting Pearl Buck while he was in Sweden. So he was quite the traveler. Is that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how he managed all the businesses at the same time and what were the gaps?
Well, what he was doing for money was writing, and it was so successul that it just brought him lots of money. Until, and I'll come to this when we talk about the agriculture a little more. Let me make sure I have it. So that gets us past this to his advocacy for ecology, and it took several forms. He was very active in an organization called Friends of the Land. He was a very popular lecturer, giving hundreds of lectures a year on ecology and agriculture. The media spectacle was, again, mainly the wedding of Bromfield, of Bogart and Bacall. He had a weekly column, he had a radio show all about agriculture, and he would give farm tours at Malabar Farm, where thousands of people would come up often on Sunday afternoon. Sort of a continuation, now that I think of it, of his Senlis salons. So this is a preview of things we're going to talk about in more depth here. First, the Friends of the Land. This was an organization that was founded in 1940 to promote soil conservation, sort of in reaction to the Dust Bowl and the effects of erosion on the land in America. And it was not like the Audubon Society or various societies that had fairly narrow focuses. This was a very comprehensive approach to ecology, and it was a non-governmental agency. During the Depression, FDR's administration created various organizations that were devoted to agriculture, and so this was to work alongside the governmental soil conservation organizations and agriculture organizations. The members were very wide-ranging. It was sort of a grassroots organization, from gardeners to farmers to experts and scientists. It was started in 1940. Bromfield didn't get involved until 1941. They quickly became very central to the organization. He became the vice president, I think, by 1942, and they accrued 5,000 members. when they had their first meeting, they only had a fairly minor turnout, but once they got Bromfield involved, you know, the membership just expanded exponentially.
Where did that start at? Where did the...
Their first meeting, well, they had their first annual meeting was in Kentucky, and so it had been sort of small regional meetings, and Bromfield hosted a group of them to come to Malabar Farm to see what he was doing there. This was just about 3 years into Malabar Farm, and an entourage of 100 cars drove from, I think it was Columbus, to out to Malabar Farm. And he treated them to a buffet, you know, on the lawn. So it started fairly small, it was regional, and then by 1943, it had its national meeting in Kentucky, and Bromfield spoke alongside Henry Wallace, who was the vice president at that time under FDR. And Henry Wallace had been previously the Secretary of Agriculture, and so they had got to know each other in that capacity. And there was some talk of Bromfield wanting to become Secretary of Agriculture. He got into a kind of wrangle with Wallace's successor as Secretary of Agriculture because he felt, Bromfield felt that the administration wasn't doing enough to avoid famine. That he was afraid, he was warning, he was like the Paul Revere of agriculture, saying, you know, famine is coming, if we don't move now to, one of the things that was happening, this is during World War II, the farmers, workers were being siphoned off of the farms into the war industries and fighting the war. And also the farm machinery was breaking down and they weren't able to get replacement parts because of all of the focus on munitions. And Bromfield had the ear of the country. He often published articles in Reader's Digest, and he launched a campaign, a scare campaign, basically saying we're going to have a famine in the middle of World War II if we don't change course with our policies. And he got the attention of the Secretary of Agriculture, I'm blanking on his name, it starts with a W, but to the point that he had to push back and respond and sort of argue with Bromfield and change some of his policies, which did stave off a potential famine. And so Bromfield wound up with egg on his face to some extent because he had gotten so much attention crying wolf. And then when the famine didn't happen, he basically said, well, you listened to me, you changed course. But it sort of tempered his reputation. He became known as a little bit of a hothead because of that. It's also interesting that he was a very liberal political figure. Having been in France, he was an advocate for the Spanish Civil War on the nationalist side, and he was actually investigated by the FBI for being too liberal. I learned that from, I wanted to call attention to this recent book by Stephen Heyman, The Planter of Modern Life, Louis Bromfield and the Seeds of a Food Revolution. It was just published in 2020, and he mentions the FBI dossier that was created by J. Edgar Hoover, concerned that he was too left-leaning. But the irony is that when he started criticizing the FDR administration, he began to move to the right. And he ended up burning a lot of bridges with the FDR administration. He had been pretty good friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, but she stopped listening to him after a time. And so it's a very complicated, fascinating story of how his political affiliations changed, to the point that he supported Thomas Dewey in the election of 1944 against FDR. And he might well have ended up becoming a Secretary of Agriculture if he hadn't alienated the Democratic establishment at that point. So, let me In 1941, he hosted the Friends of the Land lunch for 504 visitors. There's also another wonderful biography of Bromfield that's out of print and hard to find. It's by Ivan Scott. And he quotes him here saying, "My whole life has been a struggle with a dividing personality, somewhat divided between nightclubs and manure piles." And I think that expresses the dichotomy of the Sinatra of the soil, too. In 1942, he spoke at the Friends of the Land annual meeting in Kentucky along with Vice President Henry Wallace, and he wrote a primer of conservation. And I have a quote from it here. "Conservation is one of the all-embracing words in the richest of all languages." Conservation was a term that was popularized first by Teddy Roosevelt when he was creating the national parks, but it wasn't as widely understood as an important concept until Bromfield popularized it more. In its essence, it means simply saving, the saving of human life perhaps, or of old rubber and scrap iron, or earth and water and tires. In its best known and accepted sense, the word means the saving of natural resources of our nation. It's told that Theodore Roosevelt, seeking some word to cover the whole program of salvaging what remained of resources plundered by greedy and selfish citizens for more than a century, hit upon the term conservation. So, in the history of the conservation movement, Bromfield's a fairly significant figure. He even predicted that we needed to ban DDT before Rachel Carson did. So he was part of, and Rachel Carson admired Louis Bromfield. Her book Silent Spring basically resulted in legislation to stop the spread of DDT, the use of DDT. So he was a celebrity who used his celebrity, his reputation, the attention he got, to focus it on an important cause that gave meaning to his life, he felt, beyond what just being a novelist provided him. So articles in the Friends of the Land's quarterly newsletter called The Land was one of the ways he spread the word. And Eleanor Roosevelt was a big advocate of his at this point when she put in her column, My Day, everyone needs to have the land on their table. So there was a time when they were seeing eye to eye on things. But also popular magazines like Saturday Evening Post, Collier's, and especially Reader's Digest. And he worked a lot with chambers of commerce. He was elected to the National Board in 1948. He also was a well-known lecturer, very popular and in demand, and not just to big high-profile kinds of events like that Friends of the Land 1943 annual meeting where he was on a bill with Henry Wallace, the vice president. He would go to garden clubs and little small groups, and he would usually donate his speaker fees to Friends of the Land, and he rewarded local chapter organizers with visits to Malabar Farm. Do I have this on here? No, sorry. Oh, here it is, yeah. He traveled 40,000 miles annually by 1950, giving 150 to 200 speeches a year. So he was a real publicity machine for conservation. Not only writing his weekly columns, his radio shows, he was a very popular speaker. And I thought it was interesting that Heyman describes him as an unlikely lecturer because he didn't stand up straight. He acted like he was making up what he was saying on the spur of the moment. He was not a formal speaker. He broke all the rules of good public speaking, but he was very compelling. I'm getting to the end of my prepared remarks. Let's see. Yeah, I just wanted to mention one more time the famous wedding. And there's Bromfield in between Bogart and Bacall. Now, there are a lot of funny stories about that wedding. When you go out to Malabar Farm, they talk about it. I think think usually you can see the divided staircase where they came down and were married with one of the boxers. He was famous for having a whole menage of boxer dogs, and one of them walked in the middle of the wedding and plopped down at the feet of the minister. So I think that's my last slide. Oh no, one more. Yeah, the newspaper column is called A Voice for the Country, from the Country. It started in July '43. It was a syndicated newspaper column. 19 newspapers published it by the end of the year. And yeah, these are clips that you could plug into your computer and you could listen to him on the Information Please. And this is a clip, like a newsreel, where he's talking about ecology. Unfortunately, unless I email you the PowerPoint, you're not going to be able to probably get access to those. But if you do a little bit of searching, if you go to the Internet Archive, you can find these Information Please clips, which are kind of fun to listen to. You hear the ads for Lucky Strike cigarettes. Yeah, that's a good idea. You can take a picture of it if it's not too light. So those are all the slides that I have, but I'm happy to embellish anything that you would like to hear more about. We have about 10 more minutes, I think.
What was the date of the wedding?
I'm sorry, the date?
Of the wedding?
It was May 21st, 1945.
45.
And it was just about 10 days after Bogart divorced his previous wife, who was his third. I think, if I have this right, Lauren Paul was his fourth wife. And she was 20 plus years younger than he was, so it was kind of scandalous. But his third wife, Mayo Metho, M-E-T-H-O-T, I guess that's how you pronounce that, would come out to Malabar Farm before Lauren McCall came on the scene, and they were known as the Battling Bogarts because they would get drunk and they would she would start throwing things at him. And Mary Bromfield learned to lock up all of her precious bibelots. She had a collection of little ceramic roosters, and she didn't want Mayo Metho throwing those and breaking them. So they were pretty colorful, the Bogarts. And his affair with Paul started on the making of To Have and Have Not, which is based on a Hemingway novel, a screenplay by William Faulkner. And they fell in love, and that was in 1944, but they didn't get married until May 21st, 1945. Yes?
How long did he write his syndicated column?
You know, that's a good question. I don't really know the answer, but I get the impression he died in '56, and I think he was still writing it in '56. So starting in the 40s, did it say when he started it? July '43. So it went on. I mean, I don't know how constantly he wrote it, but when you go out to Malabar Farm, you see some of those in their displays. You see some of those columns. I thought it was interesting. He would broadcast those radio shows right from Malabar Farm. He was a mogul of media. He seemed to know how to reach wide audiences from a variety of methods. Yes?
So he did not go back to the family farm in Richland County. Can you talk a little bit about how he established
Sure.
our farm?
When he was growing up, his father, Charlie Bromfield Sr., was not a very successful businessman. He started out working in a bank, but he really loved farming. So what he would do is he would go around and buy up old depleted farms and then try to rehabilitate them and sell them. He was not very successful at it, but Louis would go along with him to visit all these farms. So he visited a lot of old farms in the county. And then when he came in 1938, he knew he had to leave France. And he came looking for a farm to buy. And he looked at 3 farms, the Anson Place, the Fleming Place, and the Ferguson Place. And he bought the total. They were originally owned starting in 1817 by a Scotsman named John Ferguson, and then they were divided over time. And he bought 640 acres that Ferguson had originally bought in 1817. He bought and put them all back together again. Sometimes it's referred to as 1,000 acres, and at times he would have other farms going for short times, but the basic Malabar farm land was 640 acres, I understand. And I talk about this in my performance Saturday night. When he showed up in 1938, he was full of nostalgia for what he remembered as a boy going around with his father, and everything was covered by snow. And he bought these farms covered by snow, and then in the spring realized the land was depleted, there were gullies, and so he had to learn how to conserve the soil. And he studied agriculture very seriously, and he found a farm manager named Max Drake, who was also committed to restoring the farms. And then he was so successful at it that he became an expert and an advocate for telling people how to restore depleted soil. And it was that kind of depleted soil that had led to the Dust Bowl. So in some ways, he was responsible for us climbing up out of the Dust Bowl and avoiding future soil erosion. There were a number of techniques that they used to do that. He also had some missteps. I hear often about the multiflora roses. He liked to experiment and try things, and that was one of his experiments that backfired in a big way.
Did he ever apologize for that?
Well, yeah, probably not enough, because people still talk about it every time I bring up Louis Bromfield. That's the first thing people remember.
I thought that the government leaned on him to do that.
Now, he, interestingly, in terms of his history with FDR and the New Deal, when he first started Malabar Farm, he got support from the soil conservation, from agencies of the New Deal. And then he sort of felt that they were going in the wrong direction and pushed back at them in a way. So it's possible that some of the help that he was getting was encouraging that kind of, it's a natural fencing. He objected to wire fencing. He preferred the old-fashioned fence posts, and then there had been, in the farms of his childhood, there would be wild grapes or berries, along the fencing, and that so that the fence posts were actually not all that visible because of all the wild growth around them. It also provided a place for birds to nest and to eat the insects that were, damaging the crops. So it was an ecological cycle of things. And I think I assume he thought that the multiflora roses would be a way to continue that ecological. What he didn't anticipate is that the birds would eat the seeds, and then their droppings would spread the seeds, and it would just be everywhere. Yes.
The government at one point paid people to plant multiflora roses.
Okay. Yeah.
And then, in the end of the 19th century, we were paid to kill it.
Yeah.
So, there were a lot of people who thought it was a good idea.
Yeah, he wasn't the only one, apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another example of how he disagreed with the policies of the FDR administration was when the bottom dropped out of the price of produce, grain that would be cotton, the government ordered the plowing under of thousands of acres of cotton as a way of artificially raising the prices again. And they would give subsidies to the farmers to do this. And that just went against the grain for Bromfield to see this, these crops being destroyed. Something like 60,000 piglets were killed. And so that's one of the things that got him paying attention to the policies of the Roosevelt administration that he started to disagree with. So maybe if he, well, yeah, I don't know what he ever realized about the multiflora thing. Maybe he felt betrayed by having been encouraged to do that too. But it's interesting, he gets the blame for it. Yes?
How about why he lost his popularity and his demise?
Yes, that's an important point. It's interesting, his first 4 novels were very critically successful, and then he had a series of more experimental novels that I admire. Annie Spragg, that's not the entire title, but it's about a sort of religious fanatic who dies in Italy. And it's almost like Thornton Wilder's The Bridge of San Luis Rey, where you have all these characters kind of coming together around this central event. I find that a fascinating novel. And 24 Hours takes place in 24 hours, and it's a whole cross-section of characters in New York coming together, gangsters and nightclub singers and wealthy aristocrats in New York. And there's a couple of murders actually. And he was inspired by Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, which takes place all in one day, and also Ulysses by James Joyce, which all takes place in one day. So it was his sort of attempt. He didn't consider himself a modernist writer like Woolf or Joyce, but he was trying new things. His earlier novels were more in the vein of Balzac and Thackeray and maybe Dickens, with a certain amount of risque elements that wouldn't have been in 19th century fiction. But then there was a tipping point. Around the time of 24 Hours, which was still pretty successful and was made into a successful movie. It was the first movie made of one of his original works of fiction, as opposed to writing a screenplay himself. And the theory is that he became so focused on agriculture that he started writing formulaically and not rewriting carefully and being slipshod. And I think there's some truth in that. That the novels in the later 40s began to be pretty slick in a negative way, and the critics noticed. He also was out of step in some ways with the political orthodoxy of writers like John Steinbeck and even to some extent William Faulkner, I guess, Hemingway, who were more experimental and more left-leaning. He was liberal in his beliefs in the 30s, for sure, but his fiction wasn't as... Although I was surprised, he did write a political novel about the resistance in France in World War II, which was just thrown out very quickly. So he became careless with his writing, and George Hawkins cautioned him about that and said, you're paying too much attention to the farm and you're not giving enough attention to your writing, and it's showing. And the critics turned on him in a big way. There were some really vicious reviews. Edmund Wilson wrote a really brutal review in the New Republic. The left-leaning journals like New Republic and Nation were more critical of Bromfield all along than the more mainstream ones like Saturday Review of Literature. So it was a combination of the tastes changing, I think, but also him becoming careless. I think his last fairly successful, well, I like Mrs. Parkington, which was considered from that later period, but The Rains Came in 1936, the movie in 39, was his most ambitious novel to date. It was a huge epic of this disaster in India. And I just read that for the first time recently, and I thought it was very compelling. So, starting in the later 30s, his work suffered. But I highly recommend Annie Spragg, if I could remember the beginning of the title, and 24 Hours, I just thought was big. He was more in the vein of Edna Ferber, who wrote novels like Showboat and Cimarron and So Big and Giant. He was never in the rank of Hemingway and Fitzgerald. He was compared to Edith Wharton. The panel novels at the beginning are sort of Wharton-esque, and he bristled at that. And when he wrote reviews of some of Wharton's 20s novels, he was pretty critical of her, I think in part because he didn't want to be associated too much with her. He was known for writing strong women characters, and that was consistent throughout his work. I don't know how long we want to go. I'm happy to keep going, but I just...
However many more questions we have here, we can maybe have more questions.
Okay, great.
This isn't a question, but I just want everyone to know that Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, John will be participating in Talking with the Scholars at the Chamber of Commerce building on Claremont Avenue. And so if you'd like to have more conversation, I think you can see it could be pretty far ranging. So anyway, 9 o'clock Saturday morning at the Chamber of Commerce building. Free coffee.
Yeah, and when I first developed this performance a while back in 2015, I was concentrating on Malabar Farm. And then since then, I've been backing up and doing a lot more reading in his fiction. And I developed a greater appreciation for him as a writer. And I think, the early novels that established his reputation hold up really well. They're old-fashioned in comparison to Faulkner and Hemingway, but they're very readable. And then that middle period, it gets a little more experimental. There's something kind of unusual about them. And up through The Farm is his autobiographical novel about his family. He wrote that in France, and it sort of motivated him to think about moving back to Ohio. And it's considered one of his best novels, and also The Rains Came, the epic about India. And he wrote another novel, Night in Bombay, that's considered fairly forgettable. But he was very prolific. He wrote 19 novels and about a dozen collections of stories and novellas. So there's a lot to read if you get inspired. And then all the movies that were made.